I broke into the Blackwood estate to save my dying brother. Instead, I was caught by a man they called the Clockwork Wraith. He made me a deal, 30 days in his service, and in return, he would give me the cure. I accepted, but I did not understand what living in his world would really mean. You're listening to Venom and Velvet. The seventh night bled into the eighth, and the atmosphere in the Blackwood estate shifted from a quiet hum to a deafening roar of silence. Viktor had retreated. After the incident with the cooling rod, he had become a spectre in his own home. I would catch glimpses of him at the far end of a corridor. A tall, broad-shouldered shadow in a charcoal waistcoat, only for him to vanish into the library or the laboratory before our eyes could even meet. The air he left behind always smelled of cedar and the faint ozone crackle of a storm that refused to break. I spent my days wandering the drafty halls, my mind replaying the weight of his hand on mine. My fingers still tingled where his calluses had pressed against my skin. I found myself lingering by the laboratory door, listening to the frantic, metallic clinking of gears and the occasional low-register growl of frustration that vibrated through the wood. The hunger was changing him. I could feel it through the walls. On the 10th night, the summons finally came. I was in the kitchen, preparing a tray of tea I knew he wouldn't drink, when a small mechanical sparrow, brass-winged and ruby-eyed, fluttered onto the table. It opened its beak, and Viktor's voice, raspy and strained, emanated from its throat.
The library, Mina. Now.
My heart did a frantic somersault. I smoothed the skirts of my dress, wiped my damp palms, and hurried toward the west wing. The library was a cavern of leather-bound secrets, lit only by the dying embers of a massive stone fireplace. Viktor was not at his desk. He was slumped in a high-backed velvet wing chair near the hearth, his head tilted back against the deep red fabric. He had discarded his cravat and his waistcoat. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, the fabric straining against the powerful weave of his shoulders. His raven hair was a mess, as if he'd been running his hands through it in a fit of agitation. But it was his eyes that stopped me in my tracks. They were no longer the calm, honey gold of whiskey. The pupils had blown wide, dark and predatory, until only a thin, burning ring of orange fire remained at the edges. "You called for me, Count?" I whispered, staying near the door.
Don't call me that,
he rasped, His voice was lower than I'd ever heard it, a visceral rumble that seemed to vibrate in my own chest.
Not tonight.
He sat up slowly, his movements heavy and deliberate. He looked exhausted. The severe beauty of his face sharpened by a hunger that looked like physical pain. He tracked the movement of my pulse at the hollow of my throat with a terrifying, singular focus. The 30 days, I said, stepping closer despite the primal instinct screaming at me to run. You said you would require sustenance when the distraction became too much. Viktor let out a jagged breath, his hands gripping the velvet arms of the chair so hard I heard the wood groan.
It is more than a distraction, Mina. It is a fever. I have spent a century refining my restraint, but you...
He trailed off, his gaze snapping up to mine.
You were a volatile element I did not account for.
I'm here, Viktor, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I'm not afraid of the dead. That was a lie. I was terrified. But not of him. I was terrified of the way my body was reacting to the sight of him. The way the heat was pooling in my belly as I looked at the lean muscle of his chest, and the sheer masculine gravity of his presence.
Come here,
he commanded. It was not a request. I walked to him, my knees trembling. When I stood between his legs, he did not grab me. He reached out with one hand, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw before sliding down to rest over the frantic beat of my heart. His palm was cool, but the intensity behind his touch was a searing brand.
Sit,
he murmured. He pulled me down onto his lap. I gasped as I felt the solid, hard muscle of his thighs beneath me. Being held by him was like being caught in the gears of a great machine. There was no escaping the strength of him. He wrapped one arm around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest. I could feel the silk of his shirt, the heat of his skin, and the overwhelming scent of sandalwood and old books.
You are so warm,
he breathed, his nose brushing against the skin of my neck. I felt a shiver race down my spine as his lips grazed my collarbone.
It has been so long since I allowed myself to be this close to something so alive.
Viktor, I whispered, my head falling back against his shoulder, my eyes fluttered shut. He did not bite, not yet. Instead, he leaned his forehead against mine, his ragged breath warm on my lips. His large, calloused hands moved to the small of my back, drawing me to flush against the hard lines of his thighs. There was no monster in his touch, only a devastating, quiet reverence. He began to work the buttons at the back of my dress with an agonizing, practiced slowness, his fingers trembling just enough to betray his own restraint. He wasn't taking a payment. He was inviting me into a secret. He tilted my head back, his thumb tracing the curve of my throat, as if he were memorizing the rhythm of my life before he joined it. He pushed the fabric of my dress aside, exposing the pale slope of my shoulder to the cool air of the library. His hand moved to my waist, his thumb tracing the curve of my hip through the thin cotton of my chemise with a reverence that made my breath hitch. The touch was so tender, so unexpectedly loving, that the last of my hesitation began to melt into a heavy, pulsing heat. Viktor paused, his forehead resting against mine. I could feel the frantic, ragged edge of his breathing, the sheer effort it took for him to remain still while the hunger clawed at his restraint. He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, his gaze searching, raw and terrifyingly honest.
Mina,
he whispered. His voice was a low, splintering rasp.
do you trust me?
The question was a plea, a bridge offered in the dark. I looked into those burning whiskey eyes and saw not a master claiming a debt, but a soul asking for permission to be seen. I reached up, my fingers tangling in the short, dark silk of his hair, pulling him back toward me. Yes, I breathed. The word, a small, flickering flame in the quiet of the room. I trust you. Viktor let out a low, shaky sound, halfway between a groan and a sob, and buried his face in the crook of my neck. He tilted my head to the side, his breath hot and frantic against the sensitive skin of my throat. I felt the sharp, pinprick pressure of his fangs, a momentary sting that was instantly swallowed by a surging, euphoric rush of heat. The world exploded into white light. It wasn't the cold drain I had feared. It was a rhythmic, pulsing connection that seemed to knit our heartbeats together. I slumped against him, my hands searching for purchase against his broad shoulders, bunching the fine linen of his shirt in my fists as the languid warmth of his feeding spread through my limbs. In the haze of pleasure and the slow, dizzying hum in my ears, I needed to be closer. I needed to feel the skin of the person saving my brother. The person who looked at me as if I were the only light in a century of darkness. My hand slid beneath the open collar of his shirt, seeking the solid heat of his chest. I expected the flat, muscled plane of a man. Instead, my palm brushed against the unmistakable, soft curve of a woman's breast. My eyes flew open. My heart, already racing from the feeding, gave a violent lurch. I pulled back, my hands trembling as I stared at him. No, at her. The truth rearranged itself in my mind, piece by piece, and none of it fit the shape I had known. I should have recoiled, not from her, but from the truth I hadn't seen coming. From the realization that everything I thought I understood about her had just shifted. Viktor froze instantly. She pulled her fangs from my neck, a single bead of crimson staining the corner of her mouth, reflecting the dying firelight. The predatory fire in her eyes vanished, replaced by a naked, agonizing vulnerability that shorn her of every bit of the Count's armor. She did not move to cover herself. She simply sat there in the velvet chair, her chest heaving, the masculine lines of her shoulders trembling. Viktor, I whispered, the name feeling heavy, strange, and beautiful on my tongue. She closed her eyes, her jagged breath escaping her. The real Viktor died of a fever when we were young, Mina, she rasped, her voice thick with a century of suppressed grief. He was the only son, the only heir. I stepped into his boots and took his name because a daughter could not hold the Blackwood deeds. I learned to move like him, speak like him, breathe like him. I became Viktor, so my sisters wouldn't starve. She looked at me then, her gaze intense and steady, searching mine not for pity, but for the verdict. She did not look ashamed. She looked like a commander who had finally let her guard slip, waiting to see if she would be betrayed. She reached out, her thumb catching a straight hair on my cheek with a calloused, tender strength.
I have lived as a ghost in a dead man's suit for 100 years,
she said, her voice dropping to a vulnerable, splintering whisper.
Is there anyone left in this world still brave enough to look at me and not turn away?
The silence that followed Viktor's revelation was thick, charged with the scent of ozone and the heavy, lingering sweetness of the blood bond. I looked into her eyes, those whiskey-colored depths shorn of their count's armor, and felt a wave of such profound affection it made my head spin. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I pressed them against the frantic, hidden rhythm of her heart. Viktor, my voice sounding distant, as if I were underwater. The world didn't just tilt, it dissolved. The silver moonlight, the scent of cedar, and the warmth of Viktor's skin all bled into a singular, rushing grey. My knees gave way, the strength leaving my limbs as the euphoria of the feeding finally took its toll. The last thing I felt was the iron-strong brace of her arms catching me before I hit the floor.